Franklin thought solitude was his only burden, but on Maple Hollow Trail, his world stopped cold. There, tied cruelly to a tree, a bobcat kitten trembled, left with a note pinned to the bark. Not meant to survive the winter. So Franklin cut the ropes and gathered the fragile life against his chest, never knowing that saving her would pull him into a fight far greater than loneliness. A fight for hope, healing, and a second chance at life itself. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. And if this story grips your heart, like and subscribe for more true stories of love, courage, and second chances. Franklin Harris never thought solitude would feel so heavy. It pressed on his chest every morning. He woke up alone in that weathered cabin, the windows fogged with the breath of another Montana autumn. He'd made peace with the silence. Or so he told himself. After his wife passed, Franklin learned how to let the coffee go cold, how to sleep with one arm still reaching for a warmth that wasn't there. That morning started like any other. Maple Hollow Trail wound behind his land, its carpet of yellow leaves crunching under old boots. The air was sharp, the kind that wakes you up before your mind is ready. He stopped at the bend, the one where the sunlight filters through the maples, where he and Carol used to watch deer at dusk. Even now, he sometimes paused, listening for her laugh to echo back. But this time, something else was waiting, a broken shape against the roots of a maple tree, almost swallowed by fallen leaves. Franklin's heart hammered with the same old dread, that sixth sense he'd honed over decades as a ranger. He stepped closer. Tied tightly to the trunk was a bobcat kitten, so small he nearly missed it, tangled in an old length of rope. Its fur was patchy, matted with dried mud, and the dark stain of something worse. The kitten's belly bulged, infected. Every breath was a battle. Its eyes cloudy, yellow tracked him not with wildness, but with a kind of numb resignation. The rope bit into its legs, cruel and deliberate. Beside it, half buried in the loam, was a crumpled scrap of paper. Franklin knelt, working stiff fingers to unfold it. Not meant to survive the winter. He stared at the words, rage prickling at the back of his throat. Someone had done this. Not the wild. Not fate. A human choice. And now here it was. This living thing, left to fade under the indifferent sky. Frank's first instinct was to look away. This was the law of the wild, wasn't it? He'd seen animals perish before. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slow. He'd taught rookie rangers not to interfere. But as he watched the kitten struggle just to breathe, he felt the old rules dissolving. The wild had always been brutal, but never cruel. He hesitated, torn between the voice in his head that said, "Let nature decide," and the deeper ache in his chest that whispered, "Not like this." Somewhere inside, the memory of Carol's hand on his arm, how she'd insisted on rescuing wounded things. Even when it broke, her heart rose up. He couldn't turn away. Not this time. He crouched, keeping his movements slow. "Easy there, little one," he murmured, though his voice shook. The kitten flinched, baring tiny teeth, but it was too weak to fight. Franklin drew his pocket knife and sawed gently at the rope, careful not to nick the raw flesh beneath. The rope dropped away, but the wounds remained. Angry, festering lines that told of hours, maybe days, spent fighting for freedom. He shrugged off his jacket, the flannel faded and worn from years on the trail, and bundled the kitten against his chest. Its heartbeat was a faint flutter, so fragile it made his own feel suddenly too loud. A thought gnawed at him. What if it was already too late? What if all he could offer was a kinder place to die? But Franklin couldn't let go. Not yet. He stood, cradling the small life in his arms, the morning wind biting at his cheeks. The old trail stretched ahead, golden and silent, as if waiting to see what he'd do next. As he started down the path toward town, his pace quickened. The weight in his arms was impossibly light, and yet it was the heaviest thing he'd carried in years. He glanced back at the maple, the note flapping weakly in the breeze, a question settling deep in his chest. Have you ever found yourself at that crossroads where you have to choose between stepping in or turning away? If you've ever rescued or even hesitated to help a fragile creature in need, share your story in the comments below. Sometimes, it only takes one outstretched hand to change the ending. Franklin moved with purpose, boots splashing through shallow puddles as he made his way off the trail and toward the battered pickup that still smelled faintly of pine sap and old tobacco. The kitten so light he barely felt her, yet so present she consumed every thought trembled beneath his jacket, a damp spot already blooming across his shirt from the mess of wounds. He could feel her shivering. Was it fear, pain, or just the bite of late autumn wind that seemed to cut through everything these days? His hands trembled as he dug for his keys, heart racing with the adrenaline of someone who'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The note echoed in his mind. Not meant to survive the winter. Not if he could help it. The drive into town was a blur, familiar sights sliding past as he pressed the accelerator harder than usual. Frost clung to the windows. A pair of magpies scattered from the roadside, white wings flashing in the gray morning light. Every bump in the road made the kitten whimper, but Franklin kept talking to her, voice rough but gentle. "You're all right, Willow," he said, giving her a name without thinking. "You're safe now. Just hold on." He pulled up in front of a squat, weathered building with a faded sign. Bennett Veterinary Clinic. For years, this was where he'd brought wounded deer, the occasional owl with a broken wing, once even a coyote pup tangled in barbed wire. The bell over the door jingled as he stumbled inside. Julia Bennett looked up from her paperwork, glasses perched low on her nose, her silver hair tied back in a no-nonsense knot. She recognized the look in Franklin's eyes before she even saw the bundle in his arms. Julia had known Franklin since his ranger days, back when hope came easier and the world seemed a little less cruel. "What have you got there?" she asked, already moving to clear the table. "A bobcat kitten," Franklin managed, his voice tight. "Somebody tied her up in the woods. She's half-starved and the wounds. Julia, she's not in good shape." Julia took one look, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. She reached out, hands steady as she unwrapped the kitten, inspecting each wound with clinical precision. The smell of infection was unmistakable. "She's severely dehydrated," Julia said quietly. "And that belly's swollen from infection. We'll need to start 4 fluids right away. The abscess is deep if it's gone septic. Her odds aren't great." Franklin swallowed, the ache in his chest tightening. He saw again the way Carol used to kneel beside broken animals, refusing to let them go without a fight. "If she's got any chance at all, I won't give up on her," he said, voice firm. "Just tell me what to do." Julia nodded, slipping into her practiced rhythm. "You can help by holding her steady. She's scared and in pain, so go slow." The next hour passed in a tense flurry. Julia inserting a needle for fluids, trimming away fur from the worst wounds, cleaning out pus and dirt, as Willow whimpered and hissed, too weak to truly fight back. Franklin whispered encouragements, thumb brushing lightly over the kitten's trembling head. There was a moment, while Julia prepared the surgical tray, when Franklin nearly faltered. He looked at Willow, barely clinging to life, and wondered if he was only prolonging her suffering. But then the kitten's paw flexed, just once, clutching at his shirt as if to say, "Don't let go." That was enough. Julia paused, meeting his eyes. "You know bobcats aren't house cats, Frank. They're wild, unpredictable. If she makes it, this can't be forever." Frank nodded, the truth settling cold and hard in his gut. He knew the rules had enforced them himself. once. But rules didn't always fit every story. And this one felt different. I'm not thinking that far ahead. Just today. Just her making it through tonight. The old clock ticked loud in the silence. Outside, a wind kicked up, rattling the eaves. The town moved on, as always, pickups rolling past. Kids throwing stones at the frozen creek. A woman sweeping the diner steps across the street. Inside the clinic, time hung suspended, the world shrinking to the fragile line between life and death. Franklin reached out and squeezed Julia's arm, gratitude and fear warring inside him. Thank you, Julia, for trying. Chapped. 2. Julia smiled, weary but warm. Let's give her every chance. And as the afternoon waned, the sky clouded over, and somewhere in the trees beyond town, a lone wolf howled, reminding Franklin that not everything in the wild was cruel. Some things were just lost, waiting for a second chance. Julia Bennett moved like someone who'd spent her whole life on the edge between hope and heartbreak. She didn't waste words or gestures, just nodded for Franklin to help steady Willow on the steel table. Outside, the wind keened through the clinic's old eaves, rattling the window panes like impatient fingers. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, mountain air, and a hint of fear. Willow's breaths came shallow and fast, her tiny chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. Julia inspected the abscess swelling beneath the kitten's belly, her brow furrowing. I need to drain this now, she said, her voice gentle but clipped. If the infection's spread, there's not much time. Franklin swallowed, fighting the old urge to run from what he couldn't fix. He remembered Carol's last night, the way she'd gripped his hand with surprising strength, her breath thin but determined. It's never wrong to hope, Frank. Even when it hurts. He looked down at Willow, the wild, battered creature who against all odds had ended up in his arms. For a second, their eyes met, hers foggy, but alive. He placed his calloused hand gently along her spine, whispering words he'd once said to his own daughter after nightmares. It's okay, little one. I've got you. Julia worked quickly, drawing on years of field surgeries and late-night emergencies. She shaved a patch of Willow's fur, cleaned the site, and drew a syringe filled with anesthetic. Hold her steady, Julia murmured. Franklin nodded, feeling the kitten tense beneath his touch as the needle slid under her skin. Willow whimpered, legs twitching weakly. Then her body grew limp, surrendering to the heavy sleep of anesthesia. Julia exhaled a tiny release of tension. All right. Here we go. Franklin hovered, helpless, as Julia made a small incision and began draining the abscess, working with focused, careful motions. Pus and blood seeped out, a sharp smell filling the air. Julia wiped her brow, never pausing. She's tough, she muttered. But this is a bad one. Minutes felt like hours. Franklin stared at the clock above the door, its hands creeping forward, the world outside fading to darkness. The wind picked up, carrying the distant call of an owl, a sound that had always seemed like both a warning and a blessing out in the Montana woods. Julia flushed the wound, checked Willow's heartbeat, then stitched her up in a few swift motions. She hooked the kitten up to more IV fluids, draped a thin blanket over her, and stepped back, finally allowing herself to breathe. She made it through surgery, Julia said softly. But she's not out of the woods yet. We'll know more by morning. Sometimes animals surprise us. She looked at Franklin, the edge softening in her voice. They don't always give up as easy as we think. Franklin nodded, his relief tangled with dread. He pulled a battered chair closer to the table and sat down, refusing to let Willow out of his sight. The clinic emptied out as the sun disappeared. Julia brewed weak coffee in a cracked mug and left it beside him. "Get some rest, Frank," she said. "You're not doing her any favors by passing out." But sleep felt impossible. Every time Willow stirred, Franklin tensed. His mind played old memories, Carol humming in the kitchen, the laughter of his daughter years ago, nights spent tracking lost hikers through snow and shadow. It always came back to the same question: was it better to try and lose, or not try at all? The hours crawled by. Once, Julia peeked in to check the IV and temp, then quietly hung a faded dream catcher by the window. A small, private gesture from her own family's Crow heritage. "Can't hurt," she shrugged, her eyes shining in the low light. Sometimes spirits listen better at night. Franklin found comfort in the simple ritual. He touched the old beadwork, watching it sway in the draft. The forest beyond the window was a black ocean, trees shifting like ghosts in the wind. Every so often, headlights would glide past on the road, but mostly there was just the hush of waiting, the weight of not knowing. Midnight came and went. The only sounds were the soft click of the IV, Willow's uneven breathing, and the distant, lonely hoot of the owl. Franklin sat in the dark, hands folded, whispering promises to a kitten who might never hear them. He'd never considered himself a religious man. But that night, he found himself praying not just for Willow, but for a reason to keep believing in small miracles. He thought of all the things he'd lost and wondered if, just maybe, this tiny life was meant to show him that not everything has to end in sorrow. As the wind rattled the glass and the dreamcatcher spun slow circles, Franklin stayed silent witness to the fragile thread binding hope and heartbreak together. He would not leave Willow alone in the dark. Not now. Not ever. Night pressed in thick against the windows of Bennett Veterinary Clinic, swallowing the little building in Montana's endless dark. Every few minutes, the wind found a new seam to rattle, or the old neon sign outside would flicker, painting ghostly blue lines across Franklin's face as he watched over Willow. Willow didn't move. The kitten's tiny body lay motionless on a faded towel, fur still sticky with antiseptic and dried blood. The blanket Julia had tucked over her barely rose and fell each breath so shallow Franklin found himself holding his own, listening for the next. Time became slippery. Sometimes, Franklin thought he heard Carol humming in the quiet, her voice drifting from the past, like a memory refusing to fade. Sometimes, it was only the rattle of a medicine bottle or the muted tick of the clinic's wall clock. Hours slipped by, measured only by the slow drip of IV fluids and the aching in Franklin's back. He traced the dreamcatcher Julia had hung in the window, letting his thumb find the ridges and beads worn smooth by other worried hands. It swung gently in the draft, catching the meager light and casting patterns on the floor, shadows that almost looked like moving paws. Franklin didn't consider himself a man of faith. But that night, every small ritual seemed worth clinging to. Julia checked in periodically, her voice always low, movements soft and efficient. "She's holding on," she'd whisper, not wanting to break the spell. Each time she left, Franklin felt the emptiness press harder, the fear grow sharper. He found himself talking to Willow, almost in a whisper. "You're stronger than you look, kid. Don't let go now." Sometime after midnight, Franklin dozed off, his head slumped against the back of the chair. He dreamed of hunting trips long ago, days spent tracking elk in silent woods, the world simple and wide and untouched by grief. In the dream, he found a small animal at the base of a tree, something wild, something wounded, and Carol was there, kneeling beside him, her smile as gentle as the morning sun. He woke to a jolt, a sound, faint and desperate, broke the stillness. Willow had let out a thin, wavering cry, so soft he almost wondered if he imagined it. But there she was, ear twitching, one paw flexing weakly against the towel. Her eyes fluttered, not quite open, but searching for something she remembered. Franklin leaned in, his voice cracking with relief. "That's it, sweetheart. You're here. Stay with me." Julia came running, still in her scrubs, and quickly checked the monitors. She let out a quiet laugh, a rare sound, full of relief and awe. "That's the fight I was hoping to see. She's not giving up, Frank. She's got a stubborn streak." Franklin smiled, tears hot in his eyes. He brushed a finger along Willow's ear, feeling the life pulsing beneath her skin. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough. The sky outside began to lighten, the first hints of dawn pushing back the darkness. In the woods beyond the town, birds called out tentative greetings, and the world felt, for just a moment, suspended between night and day, hope and fear. Julia handed Franklin a cup of fresh coffee, her eyes tired but bright. "You did good," she said, settling onto the stool beside him. Most people would have walked away. Franklin shook his head. "I almost did. If Carol were here, she'd tell me I waited too long." Julia smiled softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You showed up. That's what matters." They sat together in companionable silence as Willow's breathing evened out, the threat of death easing, if only a little. Franklin's mind wandered to the note he'd found, not meant to survive the winter, and felt a fierce defiance burn in his chest. Not every story has to end the way it's written. As the morning crept in, painting the clinic in gold and pink, Franklin made a quiet vow. No matter what the world expected, he would stand by this wild, fragile life for as long as it took. He watched Willow sleep, the faintest rise and fall of her body spelling hope where there'd once been only dread. Sometimes, survival is a quiet thing, a flicker in the dark, a dream catcher in a cold window, a single heartbeat refusing to fade. For the first few days, the world shrank to a circle of lamplight, hushed voices, and the rhythmic pulse of IV fluids. Willow's survival wasn't a thunderclap of triumph. It was a series of fragile moments, each one needing to be coaxed, guarded, and cherished. Franklin learned to recognize the difference between real sleep and the uneasy stillness of pain. He came to see hope as a flicker, not a blaze. Willow fought her way back inch by inch. At first, she refused food, turning her face away from the small syringe Franklin held with trembling fingers. Julia, ever patient, showed him how to mix a watery formula kitten milk and a little honey, then coax a few drops between Willow's clenched jaws. It was messy, sometimes hopeless, and left Franklin's shirt spotted and sticky. But it was the only way. Some nights, as the wind rattled the windows and shadows moved along the clinic walls, Franklin would sit with Willow, curled on his lap, feeling the tiny thrum of her heartbeat. There were setbacks, spikes of fever, moments when her breathing went shallow and quick. More than once, Julia had to change the IV or clean the angry, rope-burned wounds on Willow's legs, both of them holding their breath as she whimpered in pain. It wasn't just the physical wounds that worried Franklin. Willow watched the world through wary, wild eyes. She flinched from sudden movement, sometimes hissing or swiping with the last of her strength. "She's not a house cat," Julia reminded gently. "Bobcats are wild, even as kittens. You can't force trust. You can only offer it. Over and over." Franklin took those words to heart. He slowed himself down, every movement measured, every sound gentle. He started reading out loud in the evenings, choosing stories about the forests and the old Montana legends he'd heard from tribal elders years ago. In those stories, bobcats were forest guardians, protectors in shadow and moonlight, never meant to be owned. "Maybe you're here to remind me not to hold too tight," he murmured one night, watching Willow's ears twitch at the sound of his voice. Slowly, Willow's appetite returned. One afternoon, Franklin placed a piece of raw venison near her paws, expecting nothing. To his surprise, Willow sniffed at it, then took a tentative bite. It was such a small victory. But Franklin found himself grinning as if he'd witnessed a miracle. Progress was slow, a few steps forward, a few back, but each gain felt monumental. As Willow's wounds knit together and her fur began to shine, Franklin and Julia made plans for her next stage. They converted a section of Franklin's porch into a makeshift shelter, lined with straw, driftwood, and a heavy old blanket. By day, the kitten could bask in pale sunlight, nose twitching at the scents of pine and wood smoke. By night, she would retreat into the shadowy den, her eyes gleaming from beneath the boards. Still, Franklin felt the weight of unspoken questions. Could Willow ever truly heal? Or would fear and memory always hold her captive? He saw it in the way she startled at the cry of a hawk, or flattened her ears at the low rumble of a passing truck. Healing wasn't just about flesh and bone, it was about trust, and the slow unraveling of chains both seen and unseen. On the fifth night, as Franklin sat beside Willow's den, listening to the hush of Montana dusk, Julia came by with a quiet warning. There'll come a day, Frank, when she needs to go. Wild animals don't belong in cages, not even gentle ones. If you care for her, really care, you'll let her find her own way. Franklin nodded, though his heart clenched. Letting go, he'd never been good at it. Yet, deep down, he knew Julia was right. To keep Willow close was to keep her half wild, half caged forever. The truest act of love would be to teach her how to leave. He sat a long while after Julia left, watching the sun slip behind the ridgeline, painting the sky in orange and bruised purple. Willow stirred at his side, eyes reflecting the last light. For a moment, the old ranger felt a strange sense of peace, a reminder that every creature carries its own scars, and healing is always a kind of wild gamble. Autumn deepened in Maple Hollow, the air sharpening with each passing night. Willow's recovery moved forward in fits, and starts never a straight line, but enough that Franklin dared to hope. The kitten's wounds closed and her fur grew sleek, catching the slanting gold of late October sunlight. Still, her wildness remained. A skittishness in every movement, a flinch at sudden sounds, the stubborn glint in her eyes. Franklin learned to let Willow set the pace. He spoke to her softly while tending the den on his porch, never reaching in without warning, always respecting her space. He offered bits of raw venison and sat nearby, reading stories aloud in a slow, steady voice, sometimes about the old forests, sometimes about the trickster bobcat from Montana folklore, the guardian who slipped through shadows, never caught nor claimed. It was as much for him as for her. The ritual soothed his own loneliness, too. The porch became their shared territory. By day, Willow would sun herself on the threshold, nose quivering at every shift of wind, always ready to dart back into the safety of her den. Franklin watched, careful not to intrude, finding himself oddly grateful just to witness her curiosity waking up. He started jotting small observations in a battered journal, how her tail flicked when she was content, the soft trill she made when startled, the way her pupils widened at dusk. Sometimes, neighbors passed by on the dirt road, their glances lingering a little too long when they noticed the enclosure. Franklin could feel the questions building. But for now, the world shrank to the space between an old ranger and a half-wild bobcat, both learning new rhythms. One evening, as shadows bled across the yard and a faint frost sparkled on the grass, Franklin sat on the steps with a cup of tea, his thoughts circling the familiar ache of memories. He wasn't reading, just humming an old tune under his breath, letting the night gather around him. Without warning, Willow crept from her den, and hesitant, trembling, pressed her head against the back of his hand. For a moment, she stayed, her warmth grounding him in the present. Franklin barely breathed, afraid to move and break the spell. He whispered, "We don't truly own anyone or anything. We're just companions." For a while. Willow pulled away as quickly as she'd come, slipping back into shadow. But Franklin's chest ached with a quiet joy that surprised him. That fleeting bridge between wilderness and trust was more than he'd dared hope for. Later, Julia came by to check on them. She watched Willow pacing the length of the porch, more sure-footed now. Her wildness undimmed. "You're doing good work," Julia said gently. Then, almost reluctantly, added, "But Frank, don't forget, her story isn't yours to finish. Prepare yourself to let her go." Franklin nodded, the words settling in his heart with a familiar heaviness. But as he watched Willow slip back into her den, he realized that healing wasn't just about survival. Sometimes it meant learning when to step back, to cherish connection without claiming it. That night, Franklin wrote in his journal, "We are all just passing through, bound for a while by need, by comfort, by grace. What matters isn't how long the journey together lasts, but how willing we are to walk beside each other, even knowing the end will come." Have you ever built a connection you knew couldn't last forever but cherished it anyway? Share your story below, and let's remind each other how much a single moment of trust can mean. Rumors have a way of curling through small towns like wildfire, especially when autumn gives way to restless November winds. At first, it was just a few glances from neighbors at the feed store, a couple of raised eyebrows at the diner when Franklin came in for his morning coffee. Someone must have seen Willow sunning herself on the porch, maybe a delivery kid, maybe one of the kids from down the road, and soon, the story started to grow. "He's keeping a wild bobcat," someone muttered. "Can't be safe. Not with livestock and children around. Should call animal control before something bad happens." Franklin tried to ignore the murmurs, but he felt them nipping at his heels. Even Julia noticed the change. "Be careful," she cautioned quietly one afternoon, after a neighbor left the clinic with a forced smile. "Folks around here aren't always kind to what they don't understand." It got worse after the break-in at the old Mason place on the edge of town. A few chickens missing. A shed door left swinging in the wind, muddy prints, maybe raccoon, maybe something else. But suspicion always looks for an easy answer. That bobcat, that's what did it. Wild is wild, you can't change its nature. The talk turned harder. Voices more urgent. Someone started a petition to have Willow taken away, sent to a rescue center, or, failing that, relocated far from town. The sheriff paid Franklin a visit, sympathetic, but firm. "I know you're doing your best, Frank, but there's pressure. We can't ignore folks' fears forever." Franklin tried to reason, tried to explain how Willow had never once shown aggression, how he'd taken every precaution. But it was like shouting into the wind. No one wanted details, only reassurance. The pressure weighed heavy. Franklin felt old wounds, open memories of losing his family's trust, the years after Carol's passing, when the house felt like a tomb. Now he was back at the edge of losing something he loved, not to nature this time, but to fear. Then the storm hit. It arrived late, with thunder rolling in over the ridgeline. Dark clouds piling up so fast they seemed to swallow the stars. The wind lashed the porch, rattling the boards, turning Maple Hollow into a world of shadows and shifting light. Franklin hurried to secure the makeshift den, voice low and urgent. "Stay put, Willow. We'll ride this out." But panic is contagious. A branch slammed against the window, and Willow bolted, eyes wide, fur on end. She darted past Franklin before he could react, vanishing into the pelting rain and darkness. For a heartbeat, Franklin froze just as he had the morning he found her, helpless and alone. Then something broke inside him. He grabbed his coat, his old flashlight, and stumbled out into the storm. The rain stung his face. His boots slipped in the mud. But he kept calling, desperate. "Willow! Willow! Come back!" He searched the yard, the road, the thick trees at the edge of his land, his voice ragged in the howling wind. Lightning flashed, illuminating Willow for a split second, huddled beneath a thicket, eyes wild with terror. Franklin crawled through the brambles, heedless of scratches, and scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. She trembled violently, but did not fight. As they staggered back toward the house, Franklin whispered, voice raw, "You had once been chained to a tree. And now, I realized, I had chains too. Some chains are made of rope, others are made of fear. Both must be cut if we want to be free." Inside, as the storm battered the walls, Franklin sat holding Willow, both of them soaked and shivering. He realized then that this rescue wasn't just about her survival. It was about his own, cutting the old, invisible chains he'd carried for years. Night settled heavy, but in the quiet after the storm, something fragile and new had begun to break free. When the storm finally passed, Maple Hollow was washed in a raw, uncertain dawn. Water dripped from every branch and gutter. The whole world smelled of wet earth and second chances. Inside, Franklin sat on the floor beside Willow, both of them wrapped in blankets, steam curling from mugs of strong coffee and a dish of warmed venison. Willow ate with a hunger Franklin hadn't seen before. Her coat bristled with wildness. The fear in her eyes had dulled but not vanished. For a moment, Franklin let himself believe things could go on this way, just him and Willow against the doubts of the world. But memory and Julia's words pressed in. If you care for her, really care, you'll help her return to her wild life. That morning, Julia arrived early, boots still muddy from the storm. Her eyes, gentle, but resolved. She listened as Franklin described the chaos and fear, how Willow had bolted into the night and returned, a trembling heartbeat in his arms. Julia rested a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes loving something means you have to trust it enough to let it go. Franklin swallowed, knowing she was right. He looked at Willow, who watched the sunrise with alert, yearning eyes. Every part of her built for a world beyond the porch. He thought about how he'd tried to protect her, how that protection had nearly turned into a new kind of cage. Together, they began preparing Willow for the next chapter. Julia brought books and printouts on wildlife rehabilitation, sharing strategies learned from years spent helping eagles and foxes return to the hills. Franklin studied each one, building a small corridor from his yard to the tree line, using branches and fallen logs to mimic the wild. He scattered bits of venison and feathers to encourage her hunting instincts. Each evening, he placed his old ranger hat near the den, a silent goodbye, a wish for luck. The days fell into a new rhythm. Franklin teaching Willow to stalk, to climb, to trust her own paws again. Sometimes she'd look back at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But each time she returned to the task at hand, progress was slow. She'd hesitate at the edge of the yard, sniffing the wind, ears cocked to every distant cry. A hawk's shadow would send her running for cover. But the next time, she'd hold her ground a little longer. Franklin wrestled with his own fears. What if she wasn't ready? What if letting her go was as cruel as leaving her behind? At night, he reread his journal entries, notes about Willow's journey, scraps of wisdom from Carol, fragments of prayer he'd scribbled in desperate moments. He realized he wasn't just preparing Willow for freedom. He was learning to forgive himself for all the things he'd held too tightly. One afternoon, as the first real frost dusted the grass and Willow bounded effortlessly from one fallen log to another, Julia smiled. She's almost ready, Frank. She's learned what she needs. And so have you. Franklin watched Willow chase a grasshopper, pounce, then lift her head to the breeze, her whole body humming with life. In that moment, the ache in his chest softened. He knelt at the edge of the yard, speaking softly to the air as much as to Willow. Real love means letting go when the time comes. You deserve a life as wild as your spirit, little one. As twilight fell, Franklin built a mock den at the edge of the woods, tucking a strip of his old flannel inside a last quiet offering. He watched Willow step cautiously toward the darkness, then pause, glancing back as if memorizing his face, his scent, this strange, shared chapter of their lives. He knew the hardest part was still ahead. But for the first time, he felt peace, a deep, aching peace that comes from doing what's right, even when it breaks your heart. That night, Franklin stood in the doorway, lantern glowing beside him, and whispered into the gathering dark, "You're free, Willow. Whatever happens next, you're free." The day of release dawned gray and cold, the kind of morning that seeped through bone and memory alike. Franklin moved slowly, wrapping himself in his old ranger jacket as he prepared the final steps. He lingered over every detail, checking the corridor one last time, placing fresh water near the den, and tucking away the note he'd kept since the beginning, not meant to survive the winter. Willow paced the edge of the yard, restive and alert, her muscles coiled with nervous energy. She sniffed the wind, ears flicking to each far-off sound, a distant woodpecker, the sigh of a passing truck, the crackle of frost beneath Franklin's boots. She paused at the mouth of the makeshift woodland path, tail lashing, as if she sensed the significance of this moment. Franklin crouched beside her, hands trembling slightly as he reached for the handmade collar she wore, a strip of faded cloth, more symbol than restraint. Gently, he unfastened it, fingers lingering on the knot as though holding on for just one more breath of time. He whispered, "Letting go doesn't mean losing love. It means setting it free where it belongs." For a moment, Willow froze. Her golden eyes locked onto his, searching, maybe asking the question Franklin couldn't answer. Would he be okay without her? Or maybe she was just memorizing his scent, the warmth of his presence, before stepping into the unknown. The world seemed to hold its breath. Franklin felt every beat of his heart, every memory and regret and hope crowding in at once. All the fears, the possibility she might not survive, that he had failed her, that the wild was still too harsh, tightened around his chest. But then Willow took a step forward, then another, her paws light and silent on the frosty ground. She moved with a growing confidence, pausing only once at the tree line. There, in the silver morning light, she glanced back, a single, luminous look that seemed to hold gratitude, forgiveness, and a wild promise all at once. Franklin tried to smile, but his throat ached with the sweetness and pain of goodbye. He watched until Willow disappeared into the thicket, shadows swallowing her shape. For a long while, Franklin stood rooted in place, the cold biting at his cheeks, the silence ringing in his ears. He thought of all he had lost over the years: Carol, old friends, the certainty that kindness could protect you from heartbreak. And yet, in letting Willow go, he understood something new, that sometimes the greatest act of love is to surrender control, to trust that what you've given will survive out of your hands. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled note not meant to survive the winter. With careful fingers, he set it alight in the small fire pit by the porch, watching the words curl into ash and drift away on the cold breeze. He whispered a soft blessing to the smoke, hoping it might carry hope to wherever Willow's path led next. Inside, the house felt emptier than ever. Franklin wandered from room to room, every corner echoing with memory and silence. He found himself at the window, eyes searching the distant tree line, waiting for a sign, a movement, a shadow, a brief flash of fur. Dusk settled over Maple Hollow, soft and blue. Franklin sat at his desk, opening his journal to a clean page. He wrote slowly, each word a stitch in the wound of parting. We save animals thinking we're rescuing them, but sometimes they're the ones rescuing us. The page stayed open as night deepened. Somewhere in the woods, Willow's wild heart was beating, free and unbound, a piece of Franklin's own healing, running wild beneath the stars. Winter crept in quietly, blanketing Maple Hollow in silence and white. For the first time in years, Franklin didn't dread the long, dark months. He kept busy in his new cabin at the forest's edge, smaller, closer to the wild. The porch was littered with tracks. Foxes, deer, a passing skunk. Sometimes, Franklin thought he saw faint paw prints near the woodland corridor, pressed into the snow, smaller and rounder than any house cat. Mornings found him checking the boundary line, leaving scraps of food for hungry wanderers. The land felt different now, less like a lonely outpost and more like part of something living and ancient. He mended fences, patched the roof, and built a box for barn owls under the eaves. Sometimes, the loneliness returned a sharp, familiar ache when he brewed coffee for one, or when he caught himself setting out 2 mugs by habit. But it didn't settle so heavily anymore. Some wounds, he realized, don't heal by closing. They heal by letting the world back in. One cold afternoon, as the sun cut through low clouds and painted the world in gold and blue, Franklin walked Maple Hollow Trail. The old maples had long since lost their leaves, their bare branches sketching stories against the sky. He paused at the place where he had first found Willow, a knot of roots, half buried in frost, silent, but for the memory of a desperate cry. A sudden rustle snapped him back. From the underbrush, a young bobcat appeared, bold and lean, eyes bright and wary. For a heartbeat, Franklin's chest clenched. Was it Willow? She was larger now, fur glinting with health, a white scar just visible above her paw. The bobcat watched him, still and poised, then uttered a soft yowl, half warning, half greeting. Behind her, Franklin glimpsed smaller shapes, kittens tumbling clumsily in the snow, their coats spotted with new life. He stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Willow fixed him with a steady gaze. There was no fear now, only a wild calm, a bridge spanning the world between them. Franklin raised a gloved hand, a silent blessing and farewell. For a moment, the clearing shimmered with the sense of something sacred: gratitude, memory, and the gentle passing of time. Then Willow melted into the woods, her tail flicking in the dappled light, her family vanishing into the hush of winter. Franklin stood watching long after they were gone. Heart full, eyes stinging, but lighter than he could ever remember. He walked home slowly, boots crunching through snow, the cold biting and bright. Inside, he warmed his hands by the stove and opened his journal to the final page. His handwriting was steadier now, the words carrying more peace than sorrow. We are all wanderers sometimes. It just takes one outstretched hand to save us. Franklin closed the journal and set it on the shelf. The wind howled gently outside, and from somewhere deep in the trees came a distant, joyful cry. A sound of life, carrying through the winter night. And though the house was quiet, Franklin felt it. The circle unbroken, the wild and the tame forever touching, just for a little while.